分别总是在9月，回忆是思念的愁，深秋嫩绿的垂柳亲吻着我额头，在那座阴雨的小城里，我从未忘记你。成都带不走的只有你，和我在成都的街头走一走，直到所有的灯都熄灭了也不停留。你会挽着我的衣袖，我会把手揣进裤兜，走到玉林路的尽头，坐在小酒馆的门口。
Hello and welcome to part 2 of episode 1 of Tall Big White in China. If you have not watched the first part of this episode, I'll put a little thingy up here and you can click on that and watch it before you begin watching this, because it will make a lot of sense to you if you don't. Last time we covered all of Chinese history up to the early 7th century. Right now we're going to pick things up from that period, the Tang Dynasty, all the way up to modern China. Again, the purpose of this video is going to be to answer some questions about why Chinese people and why the Chinese government today act the way they do based upon this history. So when we're done reviewing the history, I'm going to try to tell you what I think it all means. So as always, thank you for watching, and let's pick things up with the Tang Dynasty. China was reunited by the very short-lived Sui dynasty in 589 after the Three Kingdoms period of disunity that we spoke about last time. The Tang dynasty rules China for a period of about 300 years up until 907, when it is finally overthrown by a new dynasty that will seize the mandate of heaven. The Tang is yet another one of these periods in which Chinese culture flourishes and the country is at peace. Buddhism, which is often highly associated with China, is of course an import from India. And Buddhists had been coming across the Silk Road during the Han period, but it is during the Tang that Buddhism becomes combined with Chinese folk religion. Now, Chinese religion is a huge and confusing topic, which will get its own video. Suffice to say for now, the Chinese people are not, by and large, Buddhist, but Buddhism's history in China does date back to the Tang period. Here you can see a Buddhist statue from the Tang period with the distinctive yellow, orange, and green glaze that's found on all Tang sculpture and pottery. Like the Han, the Tang had their own style in terms of art, architecture, and dress, which certainly builds off the previous style, yet is distinctively Tang. This authentic Tang painting shows us two women from the period. Now, if you look at this picture, you might notice something slightly familiar about the style, especially their hair. Now, you would be right if you notice these women do look a bit like Japanese geisha. The Tang period is also the time that Chinese culture gets exported to the islands of Japan. While something you might not want to bring up too much in Japan, the reality is that Tang Chinese culture, including Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism, all enter Japan during this period. In many ways, if you want to know what the Tang Dynasty looked like in China, you can visit Japan. The Japanese adopted this style and perfected it. The Japanese kimono is a Tang Chinese style of dress that has persisted in Japan for 1,000 years. As an example of this impact, one need look no further than the popular matcha tea that comes from Japan today. This style of grinding up green tea leaves into a fine powder and then mixing that powder with water was the style of tea drinking in the Tang Dynasty, which eventually went out of style yet persists today in Japan. We have not really looked at a map in a while, so it's worth pausing here to look at China as it existed during the Tang Dynasty. The map itself is almost identical to the map of Han China, with all of southern China having been conquered during the height of the Han period. The native peoples of southern China were certainly not Han people, and the conquest of these mountainous southern regions required colonization by Han Chinese, so that by the Tang period, the local ethnic minorities had either completely Sinified or been driven up into the mountains where they could practice their traditional culture. This movement of Han people into conquered lands is the start of a long tradition of exporting Han culture and language. As you can see, the Tang's influence was also felt along the Silk Road connecting China with Central Asia. This little strip of land jutting out to the west is today the rugged area of Xinjiang. Then and now, this area is inhabited by Turkic-speaking people. Efforts to export the dominant Chinese culture to this region began as early as the Han Dynasty and continued into the Tang period. It is during the Tang also that Islam will make its way into China along this corridor, although it will never be folded into Han Chinese culture the way that Buddhism was. By now, it should be no surprise what's coming. Eventually, the Tang rulers will lose the mandate of heaven. Now, for the Tang, this will be evidenced by a challenge by Buddhist monks to the authority of the government, followed by peasant revolts. This will lead to a harsh repression of Buddhism and bloody massacres by the government. This all ends with the assassination of the final Tang emperor and the fracturing of the state into a short period of disunity that comes to be known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, during which warlords again carve up the empire and attempt to establish a new dynasty. Within 50 years, a new dynasty will receive the mandate of heaven and establish the Song. The Song is known as the height of Chinese civilization, specifically due to the many technological advancements of the period. While the Song is not the only Chinese ruling dynasty during the almost 300-year period of its rule, it is the dominant one and the one that Chinese agree ruled the majority of China during this period. The first emperor of the Song, Taizu, was the son of a military commander of the Zhou Dynasty, a very short-lived dynasty of the period of instability following the fall of Tang. Taizu eventually rose to power through military conquest. He established the Song and was able to conquer the rest of China. Now, in the great man theory of history, we would look admiringly at Taizu. Under the Chinese view of history, his success was preordained by heaven. Heaven had given him and his family the mandate, and thus his success is inevitable. It's not his skill, it's not his doing, it's heaven's doing. Now, as I mentioned, the Song was known for its many technological achievements. The Song was the first empire to use paper money. Certainly, this is a sign that people could trust in their government enough to rely on a piece of paper that promised to be valuable. This period also saw the invention of gunpowder, the invention of the compass, and of this astronomical clock. Now let's take another look at a map of China from this period. Again, what constitutes Zhongguo in this period does not include what today makes up China. The Song controlled the heartland of the Han people in the north and the south, but had no control over the people on its borders, such as the Tibetans or the Southeast Asian people living in the subtropics. They also didn't control their northern boundary. Yet, the people living to the north of the Song dynasty had for centuries become more and more Chinese in their culture, another example of sinification. They were influenced by this powerful, literate, and technologically advanced civilization to the south, and so this adoption of Han Chinese culture was inevitable. For years, the Chinese had also been using these people, who were mostly nomadic pastoralists, as cavalry in their wars. They also married their daughters to chieftains' sons. Now, one such people were the Jurchens, who lived in what is today Manchuria. These Jurchens eventually established their own competing Chinese dynasty that was called the Jin, or the Jurchen Jin. These Jin called their country Zhongguo, just as the Song called their country Zhongguo, and they adopted much of the Han Chinese culture while they kept their northern nomadic roots. In 1115, they attacked out of their homeland in Manchuria and conquered the Yellow River Valley. So the Song dynasty was pushed south and became what is known today as the Southern Song, ruling from a new capital city, Hangzhou, near present-day Shanghai. Historians of China could choose to take the view that this is another period of chaos. After all, you can see there are 3 kingdoms on this map, but instead they chose to continue the line of the Song dynasty. The mandate in this view is not lost. So the Song will continue for another 150 years until it is conquered by a Mongol invasion. The Jurchens and their Qing Dynasty were the first to collapse to Genghis Khan and his horse lords. While initially they were allied with the Khans, the Song Dynasty eventually becomes a threat, and by 1271, the Song Dynasty is wiped out by the Mongols. The Yuan Dynasty only lasts for a century, but it is the first of two examples we have of a foreign power ruling China. In this case, China is conquered by one of many of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Kublai Khan. What is important to understand about Kublai Khan and this period is first that the Mongols embraced Han Chinese culture within China, and they ruled China as a Chinese empire. They continued the traditions of the Han. Now, in truth, they did not let Han Chinese people rise to high levels of power within the empire and kept those positions for Mongols. However, those Mongols benefited from a Confucian education and ruled the empire much as China had ruled itself. This is an important thing to understand about China. The power of Han Chinese culture is such that the Chinese never had to do very much to convince neighboring peoples to adopt their way of life. The Mongols were no exception. The second thing of note about the Yuan dynasty is the fact that it brings such a large area of Asia under the influence of China directly. Tibetan Buddhism had already been adopted by Genghis Khan as his personal religion, and thus the Tibetans are brought into China during the Yuan dynasty. Additionally, the Chinese civilization is spread further south into Southeast Asia. At the same time, China becomes more opened up to the rest of the world through the connections between the various khanates around Eurasia. For the Chinese, the Yuan is not seen as a break from the cycle of Chinese history. The Chinese view the Khans as rightful heirs of the mandate of heaven. Although they were foreign, they created a stable, just society in which Chinese people could flourish. The Yuan has another important connection to China today in that the Yuan build the city of Dadu as their capital. This city, as you can see here, is modern Beijing. Beijing in Chinese simply means North Capital, and it will serve as the capital for the remainder of Chinese history. This is a picture of the Northern Bell Tower in Beijing, which at the time of the Mongols was the geographic center of Beijing. Now, new Chinese dynasties often declared a new capital city as a way to break from the old dynasty. We haven't really talked about that, but each of these dynasties has really had its own capital. With Beijing, this tradition will end. So the Ming and the Qing will retain Beijing as their capital city, and later the People's Republic of China will also retain Beijing as the capital. This brings us to one of China's most important dynasties, the Great Ming Dynasty. I first want to introduce you to its founder, the man who received the mandate of heaven, Zhu Yuanzhang. What's interesting about Zhu is his quite humble roots. He was born into a dirt-poor peasant family. He had 7 brothers, most of whom were sold to other families, as was normal in very poor Chinese families who could not afford to feed their children. Zhu left his home as a teenager and joined a Buddhist monastery. It was there that he learned to read and write, which is something rare for poor Chinese peasants. He then left and wandered the roads for many years as a beggar before getting swept up into something called the Red Turban Revolt, targeting the Yuan dynasty. Eventually he comes to lead this revolt, and eventually it is this revolution which will overthrow the Khans and allow Zhu, as its leader, to form a new dynasty. The Ming Dynasty will prove to be one of the most stable periods in all of human history. The secret to this stability, however, was the ruthless application of power. Zhu, who takes as his title the Hongwu Emperor, creates a secret police organization that will root out dissent. Subsequent Ming emperors will engage in great purges of their own bureaucracy to root out any disloyal ministers, and peace will be maintained in the empire down to the smallest village. The Great Wall of China that tourists visit today is a product of the Ming Dynasty, more really a symbol of power than a real defensive fortification. After all, the Mongols had already invaded. The imperial capital will get a new palace for the emperor. The Forbidden City is constructed very early in the Ming period. Now, as you can imagine, a familiar story is about to happen. After 3 centuries of rule, eventually the leaders of the Ming and their ministers will become corrupt, leading to a revocation of the mandate of heaven, as clearly evidenced by famine, plague, and peasant uprisings in the country. This peasant uprising needed some help, and so its leaders called upon some Jurchen people to the north of China. We remember them from the Song Dynasty. And these Jurchens, called the Manchu people, swept down to help the rebellion drive out the final Ming emperor, who hangs himself from this tree in the Forbidden City. The Manchu warlords don't leave, however, and instead decide to establish their own dynasty, the Qing. The Qing is the final imperial dynasty. It lasts almost 300 years. You may see a pretty clear pattern here. Most of the greatest dynasties we've looked at tended to last from 300 to 400 years before collapsing. Now, the Manchu, like the Mongols before them, very quickly adopt the style of the Han Chinese. While they are seen throughout the Qing as foreign overlords, they make major effort to adopt the form of government of the Ming Dynasty. While top imperial ministers will all be drawn from the ranks of the Manchu nobility, they will be Confucian trained and have to pass the imperial examinations like everyone before them. One of the most powerful Qing emperors, and one who is renowned in China even today, was this man, the Kangxi emperor, who ruled for a period of 60 years and put his own stamp on China. The Kangxi emperor was one of those leaders who brought tremendous energy to the job. He even traveled the empire incognito in order to see how his subjects were faring. The story goes that at one dinner on the road, the emperor, disguised as a middle-class merchant, poured his ministers tea. So shocked, the ministers wanted to fall to their knees and prostrate or kowtow themselves to thank the emperor for humbling himself by serving them. The emperor admonished them that to do so would expose him. So the ministers came up with a way to kowtow with their fingers, as you can see these people doing. In doing so, the ministers felt they could show proper humility to their emperor, who, in their minds, should never be serving them. I can tell you firsthand that today in China it is often superiors or elders who serve tea in formal settings, and almost everyone of a certain age will tap their fingers, as you see here, 3 times, which is a miniature simulation of a person kowtowing on the ground. Here, in a scene from a great film, The Last Emperor, you can see the servants and ministers of the emperor doing the 3 prostrations and 9 kowtows required in the presence of the Qing leader. This example reminds us of the power that the Chinese imbued their Huangdi, or emperor, with throughout Chinese history, and it should remind us how the Chinese, even today, view their leaders. Now back to the Qing themselves, the Kangxi Emperor's reign marked the height of recent Chinese history and the height of the Qing. The empire of the Qing extended well beyond China's modern borders to include Mongolia and large parts of Siberia. The Qing also controlled most of what would later be called Indochina by the French, northern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, as well as Korea through proxy governments. By 1800, had also fully incorporated Tibet and Xinjiang into their empire, as well as Mongolia and their homeland of Manchuria. While the connections between these outlying areas and the Han Chinese civilization dates back 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty, it's actually during the last 2 centuries that these areas do come fully under the control of China. It is during the Qing that many Chinese also begin to immigrate out of China to other places in Southeast Asia, bringing their culture with them. It's why today there are many ethnically Han Chinese people living in Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And with them, of course, came their Confucian culture. Like all great dynasties, however, the Qing were doomed to lose the mandate of heaven and collapse. The signal this time? Western powers entered China for the first time and humiliated the country and its leadership. I will do an entire video about Western influence on China and its impacts, but I will give you the short version here. Basically, Britain in the 19th century had an insatiable thirst for tea, which is not surprising, and which at the time was only really grown in China. The Qing Dynasty, seeing itself as the most powerful empire in the world, refused to sell the British tea for anything other than hard currency, silver. They basically told the British that the British had nothing of interest to trade with the Qing Empire. The British set up a trading post in a small fishing village, that is today central Hong Kong, and agreed to the Chinese demands for a while, until they figured out that they could start importing opium from their colonies in Afghanistan into China through Hong Kong. The British essentially worked to addict the population of China to opium. That's heroin, for those of you unfamiliar with what opium is. The idea was to create a market in China for the drug, a drug so illegal in Britain that possession of it was punishable by death, and thus recoup the money they were losing in silver in the tea trade. Now, the Chinese, of course, eventually caught on to the smuggling that was going on in Hong Kong and attempted to throw the British out. Thus began the First Opium War, which lasted until 1842 and displayed to the entire world that Western gunships and firepower outclassed the great Chinese Empire. The result of the First Opium War is that China was forced at gunpoint to open up to Western trade. They were required by treaties forced upon them by the Western powers to open so-called treaty ports along the Yangtze River. Shanghai was born in this way. In many of these treaty ports, foreign settlements arise that further humiliate the Chinese, who are in effect not even in charge of large areas of their own country. This all signals the end of the Qing Empire, which survives the so-called Boxer Rebellion in 1900 only with the help of American Marines. But eventually, by 1912, the last emperor, the cute little boy you saw bored with his duties earlier, abdicates the throne, and China is thrown into its most recent period of chaos and disunity while it attempts to follow a new path of government. Many people mark the end of Chinese dynastic history and the start of something new with the fall of the Qing Dynasty. However, I want to propose that we look at the period from 1912 to 1949 a little differently. It's impossible not to acknowledge the massive changes that happened in Chinese society during this period, but it is also impossible to not acknowledge the massive weight of Chinese history looming in the background. In 1912, leaders in China attempted to create a Western democratic republic. The main force behind this is a generation of Western-educated young men who will shape China during this period. Chief among them is this man, Dr. Sun Yatsen. Dr. Sun was educated in Western ideals of liberal democracy with a hearty dose or two of other important ideas, such as nationalism and Marxism. Today, he is a revered figure in both mainland China and on Taiwan. He attempts to create the Republic of China, yet he is plagued by former Qing generals and functionaries who plunged China into chaos. Now, I've put 2 men on Dr. Sun's ample shoulders. You can think of them as 2 angels, or as 2 devils, or as an angel and a devil, depending on what side of the political spectrum you are on. The first, symbolically and literally on Sun's right shoulder, is Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang, also Western educated, falls on the side of Chinese nationalism, and eventually emerged as the head of the Kuomintang, or Chinese Nationalist Party. General Chiang was an ally of the United States, but also, not surprisingly before that, was an ally of Nazi Germany. The nationalists believed, as did Dr. Sun, in creating a China for the Han Chinese nationality. In effect, they wanted to let go of all the regions that had been captured by the Qing, and they wanted to rule China as an ethnically Han state. They were Western in their outlook and would have probably ruled China as a capitalist republic with close ties to Western European powers. Now, on Dr. Sun's left shoulder, we have Mao Zedong, who certainly was left of Dr. Sun. As you probably know, Mao was a committed Marxist. Mao, interestingly, came from a very humble origin. He was not foreign educated, having come to Marxist thought in China, and Mao will come to eventually lead the Chinese Communist Party, or Gongchangdang. The two parties, along with other factions, will vie for power in a civil war in China that lasts through the 1920s into the early 1930s. The civil war between the nationalists and communists will be put on pause due to the invasion of China proper by Japan in 1937. Now, the Japanese had already taken possession of Manchuria and set it up as a puppet state loyal to them, called Manchukuo. But 1937 marked the invasion of China proper by Japanese forces. I want to pause here to note that while it is taking place in the modern era, so the conflict is happening with rifles and artillery and aircraft, the internal civil wars between various factions and foreign invasion is nothing new in Chinese history. It's happened before when China has been weakened by the collapse of a dynasty, as we have seen. Now, in 1937, the Qing has only been a memory for 25 years, a single generation. Remember, the Three Kingdoms period lasted for 300 years, the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period for 50. The Japanese are another good example of foreign influence in China, which we will discuss at a later time. You may be aware that the Japanese were hardly kind to the Chinese. The rape of Nanjing and the biological experiments conducted in Manchuria are only two examples of horrendous Japanese war crimes. By 1946, of course, the Japanese were defeated, and so the nationalists and communists could turn their guns on one another again. This final phase of the Civil War lasted until 1949, when Mao Zedong finally declared the formation of the People's Republic of China from the Forbidden City in Beijing. I do want to note here that of the two parties, it was clearly and unarguably the Communist Party of China that had the overwhelming support of the Chinese people. The nationalists had had the overwhelming support of wealthy Western countries. Yet the common people of China, struggling for years during a time of chaos and turmoil, were yearning for leadership that had their interests at heart, and in 1949, it certainly seemed like the communists were fighting for the people. Mao called the People's Republic of China the New China, or Xinjiang, a break from the old, and that is still a phrase that has some common currency in China today. But the question is China today really a new China? So what does all of this history have to do with China today and how China acts in its own country, how its government acts, and how its people respond to that? That's really what we want to address in this video. I want to start by saying I'm here at Taiguili in the heart of Chengdu, and I picked this location for a reason. Here in the heart of Chengdu, we have this brand new modern shopping mall with exclusive luxury brands, great restaurants, coffee houses, tea houses, built in this architectural style that harkens back to Chinese style throughout history. At the same time, right here on my right is Dazi Temple, which is a very, very old temple also in the heart of Chengdu. And behind me in the distance, you can see the skyscrapers, the tall, high-rise buildings of a new modern China. All three, the ancient temple on my right, the brand new architecture in the back, and the brand new architecture here that harkens back to the old style, really sort of brings together all of Chinese concept of their own history. So, again, what does it all mean? Well, let me start with one example. We've seen that in Chinese history, dynasties rise and fall, and they rise with the idea that they have a mandate from heaven to rule. They fall when that mandate is removed due to corruption. And again, that corruption is evidenced not by necessarily acts of the government, but by acts of God, as we would say, or acts of nature. Let's go back to the 2008 earthquake in Sichuan right here that killed, I believe, 80,000 people. In the context of Chinese history, that earthquake itself is a symbol from nature, a symbol from heaven, that the mandate could be removed. And so how does a government respond to that? Well, they can respond in a number of different ways, but one of the ways in which the Sichuan government and the Chinese government in general responded was with overwhelming force, in a sense to minimize the damage and minimize the impact of such an event. Well, that brings us today to something like COVID-19. A lot of people wonder number one, why did China or why did the Wuhan government hide what was going on in Wuhan for the first several weeks of the outbreak? And the answer is quite simple. Pestilence and plague is one of the symbols that the mandate of heaven has been removed, I believe. And so it's instinctual. It's not like people are thinking about this, but it's instinctual on the part of government officials to say, okay, this is bad news. Don't let this get out. Let's try to control it here before it becomes, nationwide news and impacts people's confidence. That's what it's really all about. So that's the first thing. Well, the second thing is what happened when it became something that could no longer be covered up. And you saw that, again, like the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. The government's response here, as I've said in other videos, was massive. Unprecedented in terms of shutting the entire country down, coming up with all of these different ways to protect the population against this disease, and they were successful. If things in China had gotten very, very bad nationwide, that would not necessarily say to people that the government's incapable of protecting its people, although that would too. But what it's going to say more is that in a very basic way, people are going to interpret that as a sign from heaven. Right? So how do the Chinese feel about the way in which they're governed? This is something that I always am very bemused by when I read Western media, and very often when I read Western media that's very often written by Chinese expatriates, people from Hong Kong or Taiwan, who talk about the government here in very stark terms. The Communist Party is an authoritarian regime, it's a totalitarian system, no dissent is tolerated, and there's a lot of judgment that goes along with that. As a social scientist, as a historian, as a student of human culture and human government, I'm very hesitant to judge other cultures and societies based upon my own preconceived notions. The ideas of democracy and freedom have a pedigree. They have a historical root that goes in a very specific direction. It skips over medieval Europe, goes through ancient Rome to ancient Greece. Those ideas really have a birthplace, and they've come to us down through our history today. I hope you've seen in the course of this video that China's history is extremely different than Western history. The Chinese have had 2,000 years of authoritarian rule, occasionally broken by periods of chaos, disunity, and frankly, for the common people, horror. So it's hard to imagine, it's really hard to imagine how or why Chinese people would embrace a chaotic system like a democratic free society when they've never experienced that, and their own history has told them that the way in which the most people get peace and prosperity is to have a strong government with strong laws that people don't break. Living in China today, I can tell you this is a very peaceful and stable society. It's a very safe place. Other than petty theft, there is very little crime in China. People do not feel afraid to walk on the streets at night in a major city. And that is something that Chinese people value. Western people value individuality. Western people value freedom. They value the right to do what they want to do. But that comes with certain costs, in the same way that stability and order and safety come with certain costs. And the Chinese people are, I can tell you, are fully comfortable living in a society in which they have to watch what they say about certain topics in exchange for having a free place, a comfortable place to live, and a place where they're not going to be in danger. One thing I've noticed living here for a long time is that people really have a lot of freedom in their day-to-day lives. The government is really not in people's face. This is not, to use the social science terms that I'm comfortable with, a totalitarian state. This is an authoritarian state. And there is a difference between those two things. An authoritarian state is a legalist state in which the government sets the rules and punishes people quite harshly for violating those rules. A totalitarian state is a state in which people are controlled in their everyday movements by their government. And that is certainly not true of modern China. Modern China today, people's relationship with their government is much the same that it would have been at the height of the Ming Dynasty, the height of the Qing Dynasty, or the height of the Tang Dynasty. If you break the rules, if you come to the attention of your government in a negative way, the full force and power of that government is going to be used to punish you for violating the rules. But if you stay out of the government's way, your life will be stable and secure. And that is what Chinese people value. So we can talk about a number of different topics from this framework. Another topic that I think we need to go back and discuss is the idea of legalism and Confucianism within the Chinese government. These ideas still form a very, very big part of Chinese governing philosophy. The Greek model of Aristotle, of Plato, the Enlightenment model of liberal democracy, those ideas gained very little traction in China after 1912 and never really caught on outside of small intellectual circles. But all Chinese people, even if they're not very familiar with their own history, and let me say, most people aren't really familiar with their own history in America and China and England. People don't have a firm grasp on it. People's history, however, still impacts the way that they look at the world. And for Chinese people, the understanding of their relationship to the government is unchanging. So very often when I hear people in the Western media talk about China, they often talk about democracy and freedom, and that China lacks those two things. And my answer to that is, of course, China lacks those things. There is no history of that in China. Now, before I go any further, I do want to say that I'm not defending the way the Chinese government responds to its people. What I'm doing is giving you an analysis of why they do what they do, an explanation, not an apology for what they do. So I want to make that clear before I continue with this, so there's no room for misinterpretation. China has always ruled its people through the philosophy, one, of Confucianism, which says that you should listen to and respect your superiors, whether it be your father, whether it be your older brother, whether it be your teacher, whether it be your boss, whether it be your government official. So China is a hierarchical society based upon rank within that perceived hierarchy. And so Chinese people have a 2,000-year history of respecting that level of authority. The idea that people are free and independent to make their own decisions is something that never really became a part of the psychological makeup, the social makeup of Chinese culture. So when people in the West say, China is not a free country, of course it's not. But very often what I see is that they tend to tag that onto the party or the current government in China. And what I would just like to clarify is that that's 2,000 years old. That's not new. That's not Mao. That's not 1949. That's Qin Shi Huangdi, that style of government. That's Confucius. So how does that impact certain things that we see? let's talk a little bit about the situation that's getting a lot of press recently, which is what's going on with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We reviewed that this area of China, the Xinjiang region, has long been under Han Chinese influence. It's a very sparsely populated region of the world. It's one of the most sparsely populated regions of the entire world in terms of people per square kilometer. So the population of Turkic-speaking peoples there have long been in the influence of Chinese culture, and that area has been under nominal control by the Qing Dynasty and sort of for a period from 1912 to 1949, and even after 1949, the area was really under very little control. But today, it certainly is a part of China. So while I wouldn't defend what's happening today in Xinjiang, and I also would say that I don't really know fully what's happening in Xinjiang, it's not particularly unusual for the government in China to attempt to sinify non-Chinese people, to bring those people within their culture. This is something that is, again, a trend that we can trace back even to the Han Dynasty conquest of southern China. Ethnic minorities at the time were given the choice, essentially, either leave, go up into the mountains, or accept this culture. And for the Chinese in general, they do have a great deal of pride and belief that they're, like all cultures, that their culture is the best. So if we look at what's going on in Xinjiang today, what it looks like to a Western mindset is genocide. I've heard that word bandied about a little bit. And again, I'm certainly not going to defend what is happening there. But what I am going to say is that this is part of a very, very old process where the Chinese government will tend to attempt to bring the larger Chinese culture to native peoples or ethnic minorities living within their country. A lot of what happened in Xinjiang was precipitated by terror attacks in Yunnan province in Kunming several years ago that resulted in a clampdown. But the process of sending Chinese people to Xinjiang has been going on since 1949, and that process continues, and maybe the pace was picked up after those terror attacks. So again, this is part of a much larger story, and very often I think in the Western media, it's seen as some sort of immediate thing, some sort of thing that is unique to the current government in China. And what I would argue is that what's happening in Xinjiang, what happened and what continues to happen in Tibet is, again, part of a very, very long process, a very ancient process that's gone on in all parts of China throughout its history. Now let's look at something that we're all familiar with in America, but not too familiar with if you're Chinese, which is the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Something people in China don't talk a lot about because there's not a lot of knowledge about it. It was covered up by the government. So why was it covered up by the government? Again, when we look at the mandate of heaven is removed, and one of the symptoms of that removal, not the cause of that removal, is peasant uprisings or common revolution. Remember that all of these dynasties, well, not all of them, but most of them were overthrown by the people of China. There is an ancient Chinese proverb that the people of China are like the ocean, and the state, the government, is like a boat that floats on that ocean. And so, like the ocean, it can be calm and support the boat, or it can be stormy and capsize the boat. So any unrest in China is going to be seen and interpreted by the government as something that must be tamped down very, very quickly. We think of things like the Red Turban Revolt, the Yellow Turban Revolt, the Boxer Rebellion. All of these things happened towards the end of dynasties. They were all popular uprisings. It doesn't matter that they were protesting for democracy in Tiananmen Square. They could have been protesting for food. It wouldn't have mattered. It's still something that anytime you see those protests, the government is going to think, okay, we can't really let this spread. or it's going to call into question our legitimacy. And again, that's a subtle difference, because we look at it as that is the questioning of the legitimacy, but that's not how people or the government will view it here. They will view that as a signal that other people should then join in that movement, and then the movement gets out of control. So again, not justifying what happened there, nor am I justifying what's going on in Hong Kong right now, but that's the same thing. That is seen as something that a lid must be put on that very quickly. So again, historically speaking, people are, I don't want to use the word victims, but they are in some ways victims of their own history. A people, a society, a culture, even though it may not know its own history, or individual people within that society may not know their own history, they still feel it very deeply. I'm not a Christian, but I certainly was raised within a church and intrinsically understand the Judeo-Christian mindset. In the same way, someone who was raised without any religion within their lives, still in the United States, is still a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that you can't escape it. In the same way that even Chinese people who are fully committed to the idea of the new China and believe that history was in many ways wiped away in 1949, still are unable to escape from these deep core beliefs, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and these traditional beliefs about the rights and responsibilities of a government to its people. So thank you for watching this episode of Tall, Big, White in China. I hope you found it informative. I hope you found it helpful. I will be making future videos, hopefully, about more about Chinese culture and Chinese history and how it relates to the world today. Don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to give the video a like and a share. Thanks very much.
让我掉下眼泪的不止昨夜的酒，让我依依不舍的不止你的温柔。余路还要走多久？你攥着我的手，让我